have a lot of different events, and though the Farminar series is ending, the field day season is just getting started, and we'll have our field day guides ready mid-May. They'll be in your mailboxes, and if you're not a member, give us a call at the office and we can send you one, or you can also find it online. And the field days are all free to attend and open to members and non-members alike, just like the Farminars. If you do want to join Practical Farmers of Iowa, however, it is a great investment in your farm or your household, and we love your support. And it does get you some extra benefits like being on our email discussion lists, and you get the newsletter sent to your house, and you get discounts on great events like the annual conference. It's pretty inexpensive, $60 for your whole farm, and it's just check out our website and you can figure out more information about being a member, or call the office and somebody really nice will answer the phone and help you out. We also have an event calendar on our website. We have PFI events and also non-PFI events that we think are interesting and are relevant to agricultural folks in the state, so definitely give that a look. There are a couple rules for the Farminar. You can ask questions in the chat box. Andy and Melissa may address them as we're going, but we're also reserving 30 minutes at the end for questions and discussion. So, we've got plenty of time at the end, and I think we'll have a great discussion. And it looks like Andy and Melissa are here, and is their microphone working?
Oh, come on, computer. Can you hear us, Liz?
Maybe not yet. All right.
Can you hear us?
I can hear you.
Oh, great.
I can hear you. You might want to turn up your volume a little bit if you can.
Okay. Can you hear us better now?
That sounds great.
Okay.
All right, so I'm going to turn it over to you two. Take it away.
Sounds good. Thanks, Liz. So the way that we're going to approach this, I think, is that we're going to kind of give a quick introduction for folks who maybe haven't heard us speak before. For those of you who have, some of this will be repeat information, but it kind of helps to give some context as to who we are and why we're talking about this particular topic. And then I'm going to talk about two different drift events that we've experienced, kind of the process that we went through in order to deal with both of those. And then I'm going to close by kind of talking about strategies that are pretty useful for hopefully preventing drifts, so that you're in prevention mode instead of response mode, which is always preferable. So with that, I will start. If you have questions, I'll try to make sure that I'm paying attention to the chat box, so feel free to ask as we go. So let's see if I can manage. There we go. Okay, so here's the our farm business is Grinnell Heritage Farm. This is an aerial shot, and I'm not sure if folks can kind of see our greenhouses kind of in the upper central part. Melissa's going to try to use an arrow key here. So we've got our packing facility she just pointed out, and then a couple of greenhouses. Each are about 3,000 square feet. And then our vegetable beds, you can kind of see just by the coloration. We have about 22 acres of certified organic produce on the 80-acre farm. And then Melissa's pointing to the cow pasture right now. You can actually see little cows out on a rotational pasture system there. We have about 15 some odd acres in rotation, and then we've got a hay field that she's pointing out. And then she's kind of got the arrow on the asparagus, which that was the most recent drift event that we experienced. We have just under 80 acres, 22 in produce. Then we have the 15 acres of pasture, 20 or so acres of hay, and then we have 2 acres of chestnut trees as well, which is, Melissa's going to point to that, up there by the road. And then we're surrounded by town on 3 sides. You can see the development being built to the east of us. To the south are some ag fields that are in city limits. To the north, or to the west, where she's going off screen there, is a railroad track. And then across from the railroad track is a golf course. And then to the north is a conventional corn soybean field. And both drift events came from the north. So we will see We'll see more maps later, but this is probably the most clear as far as color goes. So, and I need to take the arrow off. There we go. So there's a picture of Melissa and I. I moved here in 2006. The farm had been a conventional corn, soy, alfalfa farm that my aunt was basically managing. And my great aunt co-owned the farm with her. She wanted an out, so she let my uncle and I in. And that was my in to farming. And I grew up about 2 hours northeast of here in a small town called Hopkinton. And my background was in more in livestock, but I got interested in doing this as a Peace Corps volunteer, and I've kind of been doing it ever since. And Melissa had the good fortune of meeting me and deciding that she liked me enough to move and work on an organic vegetable farm. She's not standing by the mic, so I can say that. Her background is in accounting. She's from up in the Twin Cities area of Minnesota. And before we met, she was working in Minneapolis and living in Chanhassen. Yeah, so we've got family here. We always have to talk about kind of what makes our farm tick. We've got 3 kids, and my Aunt Janet, who was the one who was managing the farm before me, she still plays a very active role and pretty much works full-time, even though she doesn't really have to. And then we have a number of staff as well. We've got a really great work crew. We've got probably, 6 or 7 folks that are all coming back for multiple seasons now. And that makes what we do much easier. So the farm business, so where do we move 22 acres of produce? We have about a 300-member CSA. We do 3, or we're going to do 3 markets this summer, one in Iowa City on Saturdays, the downtown Cedar Rapids market on the twice-a-month one downtown, and then we're going to go back to the downtown Des Moines market on Saturdays as well. And then we sell wholesale to select grocery stores, co-ops, and restaurants. So New Pioneer Food Co-op in Coralville, Iowa City, and now Cedar Rapids is a great customer of ours. And we sell in the Des Moines area this kind of the same way. And we do have, you saw the picture of our small grass-fed beef herd. We manage them mostly for winter bedding pack that we compost and then spread that on the fields in the fall. And then we do some organic broiler chickens, but not every season. So I don't think we're going to do those this year, just for labor reasons. So that's kind of in a nutshell who we are and what we do. If you have more questions about that, about kind of what we do speak at quite a few different events. And I'm not going to go too much more into that because we're going to talk more about the wonderful topic of pesticide drift. If you notice sarcasm there, it's for a reason. So, the first thing I'd like to say is that this is, I think, the second PFI Farminar that has dealt with this, and the first one was back on February 24th of last year, and Rob Fox from Genuine Fox Farm presented that one called Pesticide Drift, Response, and Compensation. And that is available in the archive on the PFI website. I just refreshed myself by watching that yesterday. And Rob really did a really good job of covering what should be done following a drift event, and kind of walking through like the immediate aftermath of what they went through. And so if you want like that kind of detail, that's a really excellent place to go in and view that archive. Rob did a great job of kind of bringing a lot of things to light. So I'll touch on some of those things in our presentation, but if you want to go into more detail on some of those things, he even has like nice screenshots of like the IDOL's website and things like that in there, so it makes it pretty easy to find resources that way. So thank you, Rob. So the first thing that I'd like to touch upon, I guess, is how we were introduced to spray drift. And in 2009, we had just been certified organic that year, and our hayfield still was in transition. And it was eligible for organic certification in the fall of 2009. And so we woke up in July, and for those of you who live in rural areas, you know that aerial spraying is kind of in full force by then. And I see that Liz has just said there's a link to Rob's Farminar in the upper right corner, so thank you, Liz. So it was in July, and I usually keep a notebook with me. And so when things happen that I think I might not remember accurately, I usually write stuff down in a notebook. And so I have in front of me, but you can't see it on your screen, I'm going to kind of read a little bit off of what I wrote in my notebook that morning. So it was, 8 o'clock in the morning, and we had a plane. You can see our greenhouses. One has plastic on it and the other doesn't. Right there. The plane was flying north-south over that corn-soybean field. At that time, it was in seed corn. And they were banking really low over our cow pasture to turn around. And so it was 8 o'clock in the morning. We noticed it was bothersome because the wind was blowing out of the north towards us. So I called the farmer neighbor who farms north of us, and he picked up his phone, and said that he would do what he could to get them to stop. It was a seed corn field, so he really didn't have control over what was being applied or when or who was applying. That was a call by the seed company. And nothing really happened. The plane went back to the airport, and so at 8:50 the plane was back and still banking low. And so I called the airport and tried to get a hold of them to tell them to have them turn the plane so that they aren't buzzing our cows or flying right over our field. And then at 10 o'clock or at 9:22 I guess, finally we noticed that I got a hold of the seed company rep. And we told them, what was going on, and that we'd seen spray drift across the road, because there's a road between us. And the reason that we could see the spray drift across the road, even though it was way at the other end of the field, was because there are power lines on our side of the road, and you could actually see the spray go underneath the power lines. And so we knew that we'd had a drift event. We just weren't sure how big it was, and it was on a hayfield that was in its final couple months of transition. So that was kind of our introduction to spray drift. My blood pressure went through the roof, and I was pretty stressed out. And Rob can, if you watch Rob's archived Farminar, he went through something that was far more traumatic because he was actually sprayed in his field, and we just saw it from afar. But even that was stressful enough, so I can't even imagine what he was going through. So what I'm going to do is I feel like this is something that happens quite often in Iowa. And it's one of the dirty little secrets of conventional ag, is that the spring in Iowa especially is very windy, and so there are very few days or hours even that you can apply when the wind is not blowing. And so a lot of times things just get sprayed even if the wind is blowing. And so I'm not trying to point fingers, and I'm not trying to assign blame. But if you're going to, farm 5,000 or 6,000 acres and cover all of those in a timely fashion with some, herbicide from the ground or some fungicide or pesticide from the air, you're going to have to be out there perhaps when conditions are not ideal. And so, driving around the countryside, anecdotally, you talk to a lot of people that have had, their cars get wet from aerial spray. I'm not trying to assign blame, but what I want to do is I want people to know that there's a process that you can go through, kind of the timeline that you might want to expect or you could expect, and then what you can expect from the state. So I'm going to show you a bunch of documents. Don't worry too much about what's actually on these. So I called IDALS that first day, and they sent an inspector out 2 days later. So that was on, I believe, if I go back a slide, it was on, if you see it, as 7/7 of 09, and then they, on 7/9, so 2 days later, they sent the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship, is what IDAL stands for, sent an inspector out and asked me a bunch of questions, and they gave me 3 documents that day, and I'm going to show you kind of a picture of each. So here's like an initial inspection document, and then basically the inspector, if you suspect a drift incident, they're going to kind of take some photos and maybe hand draw a map, or if you have an aerial map, they'll use that. And they're gonna kind of label everything and make it very clear so that if they want to go back to this 6 months later, they can. So this kind of just documents what he took away from our place. So you can see that there was like a notice of inspection, an affidavit, a hand-drawn map of the hayfield, et cetera, and some photos. He also took vegetation samples, and you can see that he took A through F. So what is that, 6 samples? We could see kind of the extent of what got drifted upon, and so that was where we directed him. But how far did it go into the field? That's why he took multiple samples in the hayfield. So, and then the third one is just a narrative. So he sat down with me and asked me what was going on and timing, and so that sheet that I just kind of summarized for you that came out of my notebook, the inspector gathered most of that information and put it, condensed it onto one sheet, so that again, 5, 6, 7, 8 months later, you could go back to it and say, once they, follow through and talk to the applicator, is this what really happened? They can do some cross-referencing to make sure things are accurate. So this is 2 days after the drift event. I'd called, the seed company. I'd called the airport. I called the neighbor. I called my organic certifier. I called IDOLS, and 2 days later they sent an inspector out, and this is what I ended up having after 2 days. So then we jump ahead to 9/23. So a little over 2 months later, the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship sends out, or at least at that time sent out, a communication regarding the lab results, which is actually quite a fast turnaround time. In our second drift incident, this didn't happen quite so quickly. So 2 months later, we'd gotten our lab results. They were applying at that time a fungicide, and this is the lab result. So you can see it's quite small, but if you can kind of zoom in on your computer, we ended up, they'd done the lab result, or they'd done the lab testing about a little less than, or about 2 months later, I guess, and notified us. And this is, we ended up getting 6 sheets like this, and the other ones came back negative. So this is the one that came back positive, and you can see the active ingredient is there by the arrow, and then it tells us how many parts per million were there. So 2 months afterwards, we had confirmation that yes, indeed, we did have a drift incident. So in the interim, what were we doing? And between July and September, we made hay once, and so on the advice of our organic inspection or organic inspectors, we go through MOSA, the Midwest Organic Services Association. They said, okay, if you suspect that you've been drifted on, just treat it like you have been. So segregate that hay. So, mow it, rake it, bale it last, and then store those bales separately. So we'd done that. And so we felt like we'd kind of covered our bases pretty well. And hay is a much easier thing to deal with in that regard than our vegetables. So we didn't hear anything from IDOLS after that, what happened, or getting that letter in September. And then we received I think a 2-page document from IDOLS, and this is just the first page of that. And don't worry too much about the language. But basically, it was addressed to the company that operated the plane, and they were found to be in violation, and so I said on there, note the $540 civil penalty. So they were actually fined by the state, and then that money goes right into the state treasury. So they make that fine out to the treasurer of the state of Iowa, and it's my belief that it goes into the general fund. And Liz, you might know that better than I do, and if I'm wrong, would you correct me in the chat box? So once we had this document in November, we had asked the flight company who their insurance company was, and so we sent the insurance company a certified letter saying, here we have lab results, which your client also has, and you have this sheet showing that they were in non-compliance, which your client also has, and they've been forced to pay a civil penalty. So we would like for you to make this right with us, because we're not only are we losing the eligibility to be organically certified on the hayfield, we also would be we're not going to be organically certified for 3 years. We have to go through another 3-year transition, and we have to do extra work in segregating hay and make with livestock. for breeding stock, you have to feed if you are going to feed non-organic hay, you have to feed it in the first 2 trimesters. And so what we had to do is we had to segregate that hay, and then store it in a separate place, document that we stored it in a separate place, and had treated it separately in the field. And then we also had to document when we fed it to make sure that we weren't in non-compliance for the calves that were born, for them to be organically eligible. So with that, I kind of started on this slide before, so we reached out to their insurer, and this took some time, going back and forth with the insurance company, and we ended up reaching a settlement with them on September 2nd of 2010. So it was more than a full calendar year later when things were actually settled, and that particular company made us sign a confidentiality agreement with them in order to get a settlement. And in retrospect, it's unfortunate that that's how they operate, but I think I understand why. They're wanting to minimize payout if they can. And we decided that that on a small hayfield like that, it just wasn't worth trying to take something to trial. And Rob kind of went over some of do you try to settle, or do you try to go to trial in his Farminar too. So needless to say, it is not a money making or a money generating way to farm, trying to get sprayed upon or get drifted upon. So Melissa's giving me a look of like, that's not very, your English is not proper. So this is an overhead map. So if you can kind of visualize that first screenshot that we showed of the farm. So this is the farm to the north. So north is in this direction here. So the plane was flying back and forth and then banking over us in kind of a pattern like this. And our cows were in pasture over here, and he was getting pretty low. So we ended up having field Z, which is what we ended up calling our non-organic hay, which is over in this corner. It was a whole plain spray pass worth. And so we had to segregate that for 3 years, and it became organically eligible in 2012 again. And so it's been certified since. And then we store, or you can see you can see this long rectangle right here. This is where we store our organic hay for the fall and winter. So we kept all of this other hay in that normal place, and then we stored our non-organic hay up here, and it was, you can see it says hay storage for non-organic hay was up here by the barn. And so then we just had to keep records to show that we had, treated that in an appropriate fashion. So hopefully that particular incident is clear to folks. So it took over a full calendar year to get a settlement, to reach a settlement, and we did have to adjust how we managed some of the hay coming off of that field Z, how we dealt with it organically, and it was definitely a hassle, and it definitely got my blood pressure up. That's for certain. So with that, I'm going to go ahead to the second drift incident. I think we're about on schedule right now. And so this one ended up being, I don't know. Melissa, do you have anything to add to that particular, before we move on from the hay? She's shaking her head that I covered most things. The second drift incident was in 2013. And we have on the farm, if I go back a slide and show you on the arrow. So the asparagus field, you can kind of see this long rectangle here. It runs east and west fairly close to our north property line. So this long snaky thing here is a road. And then we have a 30-foot, so there's the ditch, and then we have a 30-foot buffer on our side of the fence that we have planted to native shrubs. And most of those are about probably in the 6 to 9 feet to 10 feet tall range now. And the idea is by having a 30-foot buffer, 30 feet wide that is, we're hopefully allowing or we're reducing the risk that our actual cash crops will be hit by drift should a drift incident occur. It's not that we want it to be sprayed. It's just that we recognize that we live in a neighborhood where people do apply these things. So we've taken them, and that's a pretty standard thing for organic producers. Most organic producers do have a buffer strip around the edges of their organic fields if they neighbor a conventional field. So our asparagus was right along here. And this particular drift incident, it was again in a seed corn field, so it was the same neighbor. And in those circumstances, usually the farmer will plant according to the seed company's specifications. But then the seed company really kind of takes over pretty much all management of that field. So like timing of spray, what gets sprayed, detasseling, all that kind of stuff, harvest, pretty much all of that happens. The seed company handles all of that. And so the farmer really has no idea what's going on because they're kind of out of the loop. They don't need to know. So because we had that first incident when it was a seed corn field, I'd convinced them that they should be doing ground application at least close to us instead of using aerial applicators. And so they listened to me, but they apparently either didn't communicate that to the applicator, that we were present, even though we have no spray signs pretty much all the way along this border. We're registered on the Sensitive Crops Registry. We were registered at that time on the bee registry. I had talked with the seed company representative that spring, letting them know that they needed to be aware of that, that we were there and that they had to be careful. And so on a day that when the wind was blowing about 15 miles an hour straight at us, the guy pulled into the field and started spraying, but instead of going north-south, he was going east-west. So he was going back and forth like this. And as the day went on, he started kind of farther to the north, and as the day went on, he got closer and closer to us. So I'm actually kind of wrong. He started out here and got closer and closer to us. And I was notified by my crew that something was going on because they were complaining about the smell because it smelled so bad. And so the drift ended up going from their side of the road all the way across 2 ditches and the road across our 30-foot buffer, and we found out later that it did indeed hit our asparagus field. I managed to get the guy stopped because I drove my car out onto the road, and then I jumped out and was waving my arms as he was turning around, waving my arms frantically through the air, and I did manage to get him to stop spraying. Otherwise, I think, because I'll go back a slide again, there's a house here, and it totally got drifted on that day too. But he sprayed this field before he got around to this side. So if I wouldn't have stopped him, we would have had all of this hayfield would have been contaminated as well. So I got him stopped, and at least he did respect that. And after my first experience, I learned, again, I was carrying a notebook, so the first, I asked him, what's your name? Who asked you to spray? What are you spraying? Are you insured? Who's your insurer? And I basically, within about 5 minutes, I let him know that, you need to stop. I'm going to call IDOLs, and they're going to send somebody out to take foliar samples. And if we're contaminated, I'm going to hold you accountable. But my blood pressure didn't get nearly as high in this particular instance because I'd been through it before. And, he was, to his credit, he was apologetic. He had not checked the sensitive crops registry or the bee registry, so right there is a violation. And he was spraying a synthetic insecticide in the middle of the day with the wind blowing over 50. I mean, he had numerous violations, so which we can get to later. So, and that was in August. So for those of you who know asparagus, you know that you're not harvesting asparagus in August. And so the asparagus was already had ferned out. So we knew we didn't have to pick again until the spring. And so my circumstance, or our circumstance here again, was quite different from Rob Fox's circumstance, because we had a crop that was sprayed that wasn't for immediate human consumption. So that we didn't have, they ended up doing some private testing, Rob and Tammy did. because they had crop that was ready to harvest, and they had to know what was sprayed and if it was safe for human consumption, or if they just needed to destroy the crop. So they ended up springing for private lab results, and we had the luxury of waiting on IDOLs again. So again, we got the initial inspection document, and that was, so it happened on the 12th. They didn't get out there for 3 days this time. And I documented any rainfall that we might have, things like that. Rob, I think, actually ended up taking samples himself, according to some.
And Rob also bagged his clothing, which in hindsight ended up being a really good thing for him.
Yeah. So we did have quite a few people in the field further to the south. And that's how I was notified. I was in the packing shed doing some work. And this insecticide that they sprayed, it smelled kind of like when you went outside, especially when I got really close to the sprayer on the road, it smelled like I was licking a railroad tie. And so it had a really strong creosote type smell to it. So we got the inspection document. The second page just kind of talked about what they did. So again, they had a notice of inspection, which you just saw. They took plant tissue samples. So they did some in the hay and alfalfa field, where luckily we didn't have drift this time. Further to the south, we had a kale field, and so we took samples there too, just in case it drifted all the way through the asparagus and passed. And then we took samples along our asparagus patch. And then they had digital photos, like an aerial photo that they used for documenting where they had everything, or where they took samples from everything. So, and then the page 3 again was my narrative. So if you end up having to call IDOLs out, those are the 3 things that you'll kind of get back from them. They give it to you right, that's like a carbon copy paper, they'll give it to you right there. And you can correct anything, so you can see on this one, he wrote something down that I didn't agree with, and so he blanked it out, and then he had my initials are right next to it to make sure that that it's okay. So it's pretty straightforward. The IDOL's website is not the easiest one to use, but you just you need to get a hold of the pesticide bureau at IDOL's, and I was pretty emphatic that time. I was like, we're a certified organic vegetable operation, and we've been drifted on. We need somebody sent out as soon as you can, and they tend to be pretty responsive, and they've always treated me very nicely. So again, we got our lab results back. We had a cover letter like we did the last time too. The lab work wasn't done though all the way until January of 14. So we were operating under the assumption that it's probably contaminated. And that particular kale field as well, we kind of operated under the assumption that that's probably contaminated, so we just didn't pick it. We had a big enough kale planting that year that we were able to leave that portion of the kale field just kind of unharvested. And we didn't even get this letter though, so it was done in January. We didn't get the letter until April. For those of you that know asparagus, again, we're pretty much ready to pick it by then. So I had made some phone calls and had found out that it had been contaminated prior to that, so that we were able to let our customer base know. Yeah, yeah. And so, so following this confirmation of contamination, so it was kind of the same process. We reached out to the applicator's insurer, and I'd gotten that information from day one. And so I got their insurance company in the loop immediately. So I actually called them the same week that we were drifted upon, saying, likely there will be a claim coming coming your way. Again, they received all the same documents. It took some time, and we had back and forth emails with their insurance company. I wasn't as anxious this time around because I knew it would take some time. We knew it wasn't going to be like, oh, we'd be done in 2 months. And again, because it was a vegetable crop instead of hay field, the paperwork, it definitely was not as straightforward as a hay crop. Like a hay crop, you can say, estimated tonnage per acre, and hay is worth X. Organic asparagus is a little bit trickier. So, and in Rob and Tammy's case, it's trickier yet because it's more than one crop. At least for us, it was one perennial crop. So it wasn't like we were planting one vegetable crop one year and then trying to plant another vegetable crop another year. Like they have some fields that were contaminated and some that weren't. So how do they choose what to put where in order to make sure that they get the crops that they certainly want to be organic on in the right field. Theirs is definitely a more complicated process than ours. So, sorry, Rob and Tammy. So now what I'm going to share is the initial sheet that we sent to the insurance company for for negotiating compensation, and it's a little bit small. So if you have a hard time seeing it, I do believe that there's like you can see the full screen. So if you click, I think everybody can see that tab on the top. If you can see full screen, you should be able to click on that and see this in a little bit better detail. And when you look at the numbers, don't anybody have like a heart attack? So in what did I do, Melissa?
I don't know.
Hopefully everybody can still hear me here. I don't know. My screen just left me, so if anybody can still hear me, hold on for just a minute.
Hey, Andy. Yeah, I made it full screen for you, and I think we could all hear you.
Okay, I just got my screen back. Can you guys hear me?
Here, we'll try and make it full on our end. How about that?
There we go. Okay. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this, or Melissa can. I don't know if you'd prefer to do this, honey. Okay. So like I said, it's a little not quite as straightforward. So what we did is we lost organic certification on the asparagus for 2014, 2015, and 2016. And the crop will be eligible for organic certification again in August of 2016 because it's 3 full years to transition back to organic. So we keep pretty accurate records. For those of you who have seen us present in other places, we oftentimes Melissa and I are harping about keeping records, because you do end up going back to those and using them, especially in the off season. One of the nice things about being certified organic is that you're forced to keep some records. So if you're not maybe the best record keeper, it is kind of someone helping you stay honest and on top of it, I guess. So so this column here is yield or projected yield. So in 2013. Oh, let me think about this. In 2014, we actually had this number. We actually picked 4,910, is that bunches? Bunches of asparagus this last calendar year. And so what we were able to do is our asparagus patch is not really that old. It's still kind of on the increase. And we also we plant soybeans as a cover crop in our asparagus crop. So we have a really weed-free asparagus patch. And it looks really, really nice. Pretty much everybody that's come out to look at it has complimented us on it. So we're pretty confident that our yield is going to keep increasing. That's why as you look at 2015, we're actually expecting quite a yield bump. And then in 2016, another yield bump. So all the way up to 9,600 bunches. And we kind of arrived at those numbers both by looking at the Knott's Handbook for Vegetable Growers. And then we also talked to Iowa State Extension, and their horticultural specialists said that yes, it is reasonable to expect on ground as good as what we have, possibly 3 tons per acre yield, which is about 9,600-ish. It's about 9,000 bunches. And the reason Melissa is saying the reason that the yield is going up is that asparagus oftentimes won't peak in yield until about year 7 to 9, and we're not quite there yet. So what we ended up doing then, the next column is crop income based on conventional price. And so what we did is we took all those numbers and we said it was $2.99 per unit conventionally. And for organic, we estimated that it was $5.99, and we came to that conclusion based on looking at grocery store prices for conventional asparagus, farmers market prices for conventional asparagus, and then we also talked to we saw what we had been getting organically, what organic asparagus went for in the grocery store, and then we talked to some other growers like Ben Saunders at Wabi Sabi. kind of gave us some advice as to what organic asparagus can go for. And so what we did for the insurance is we figured, okay, we're going to be selling it conventionally, so we'll take out the conventional price because we're still going to pick it. We're not going to just let the plot go. And so we strip that out. That's the next column, which is lost income, is the difference between conventional and organic. And then the fourth column ends up being, for those of you who are familiar with managing a crop organically, that goes all the way through the field, through harvest, through distribution, through sale, all that kind of stuff. And so one of the problems is that we have a packing shed that's built for handling organic produce, but then we're now introducing a conventional product in there, and we're washing it, we're handling it, we're putting it into CSA boxes, things like that, and so it actually can't even physically come into contact with like a CSA box. So normally what we did in the past is we would just take an asparagus bunch and put it in the box. Well, now we were forced to bag it prior to putting it in a box, which that's an additional labor step. You have to, the bags aren't that expensive. It's mostly the labor. And so what we did is we just kind of calculated, and another thing that would be in there would be like if it's muddy and you're out there in the field, or you get your hands with asparagus juice on it, really you need to be, sanitizing your field knives and your hands before you go and do anything else. So we had to walk all the way back up to the packing shed and wash things prior to going back out to the field, which we normally wouldn't have to do. Melissa, do you have anything else to add for that?
No, and I think Andy kind of touched on this, but when this happened, we used it as an educational piece with our CSA. So when we found out that we were indeed contaminated in the spring, we sent an email to our shareholders, our CSA shareholders, and we gave them an out. And so this is kind of built into that cost. We really thoroughly explained what happened. We explained that in their shares this year and for the next 3 years that they're not going to be able to get organic asparagus and that it's going to have to be bagged. And we explained all of the steps that we would have to go through. And we gave them an out because some people are really particular. They want just an organic crop. And so it felt like we needed to be very transparent with our customers. And so that's kind of how we handled that. But we didn't have anybody back out, so we were pretty fortunate on that end. Andy?
Yeah. So other things that would kind of and we also, you can see that we adjusted for inflation in there too. So each year, I think I can't remember what the number. We just used 5%. We said 5% inflation per year. So like the costs go, like the price goes up 5% a year, and you can see that the $250 increase there from year to year is taking into account that particular thing. So then in the total loss due to the incident, we estimated at being $84,225.66. So can we go to the next slide? I'm not sure what you did there, Melissa.
I don't know either. Hold on, sorry.
Yeah.
Can you tell me what I did? I clicked out of full screen. Steve is working on it. That's great. Share document or share my screen? Steve, I really like you. Thank you. Okay.
So having kept their insurance company in the loop, yeah. So having kept their insurance company in the loop, that was the initial document that we gave to them. This is another sheet that we use. So there's another spreadsheet that we presented to the insurance company. So we knew from 2012 what our yield was, and you can see here that in our QuickBooks now we have conventional asparagus and organic asparagus for CSA, and then we have the same for farmers market and the same for wholesale. So we had to create the line item for conventional asparagus, and now we have to track that over the 3-year transition. So we knew what our yield was in 2012. Remember, 2011 was a really dry fall. 2012 was really drouthy and really hot early. I think was that the year that we got up into the 90s in March. So we ended up having some of the asparagus came up fairly early, but our total unit sales were 2,419. 2013 it was 3,475, and then 2014 was 4,910. And so that's how we came to the conclusion that we could project a larger yield, because it looks like the patch will kind of start out slow and then kind of grow and then kind of keep growing, and then we kind of expect it to peak somewhere in here and then gradually probably decline a little bit. And so that's how we came to those numbers. So for insurance purposes, we were using actual figures for 2014 and then just projected figures for 2015 and 2016. So there we go. We figured it out that time, Steve. Thanks. So if we can go to the next slide, we also had to present to the insurance company. This is from our organic certifier, basically saying that we had notified them of this potential drift incident, that it came back positive. So indeed it was. So indeed it was a contamination event, and that yes, it did take 3 years to transition back to organic, and that was just something that the insurance company required. So Steve, it appears I did the same thing Melissa just did. Sorry, everyone. So when it came to settling with the insurance, they kind of dithered. They actually ended up contacting quite a few folks from Iowa State Extension, from Iowa State, and the Iowa State Horticulture Department. They ended up contacting some grocers, looking at prices to kind of double check our figures. And here's the map you can kind of see again. So they ended up doing a lot of research on their end. So it took quite a bit of back and forth, and kind of arguing, is that accurate? Is this accurate? And so if you end up getting drifted upon, this is something to expect. Like, the insurance company doesn't want to make a bigger payout than they need to. So that just expect that there is going to be a back and forth. So several emails and phone calls and visits. So some of the lessons that we learned from this. And we did reach a settlement, which I don't know if I must not have had a slide in there. No, I didn't. So we did reach a settlement last fall. So it was again over a full calendar year later. And that one is confidential as well, but realize that the numbers that we ended up showing you there is what we approached them with, and it is a negotiation, so that is not what we received necessarily. So some of the things that we would recommend for folks if you end up going through something like this. These settlements are a negotiation, so definitely start high. So you saw, like, we were going for very aggressive yield projections. I think they are accurate. So it needs to be start on the high end, but make sure it's reasonable. So we went with something that we actually expect to see, and what we actually could expect to sell. The second point, and I kind of touched on this earlier, is that good record keeping does help quite a bit, and for us it really helped in asparagus because it allowed us to use our own sales data. So we could say, look, here are receipts showing that we actually sold asparagus for this price. Not, we think we could sell it for this price. We actually have sold it for this price. The next thing is to be assertive, because pesticide drift is against the law and we do have property rights. So don't just say, oh, this is how it is in Iowa. If you have damage, be assertive about your rights. Communication with the neighbors is key to prevention. Both times that we had incidents was when the control of the spray was out of the farmer's hands who actually farms the ground. It was somebody who wasn't farming there. It was a seed company, and they had hired custom applicators who really didn't know the area. This particular farmer that actually farms that ground has been a good neighbor, and he usually actually calls me the day in advance, letting me know that they're thinking about it. So And then the next thing is that many pesticides are not labeled for application on fruit and vegetable crops. So you need to read labels and ask experts if you don't really know what's at risk. So we were fortunate in that both times we were drifted upon, um, one was on a hay crop which wasn't for human consumption, and the next time we had a pretty big window to do the research because we weren't going to pick asparagus until the spring. So make sure that you're asking questions. What's been applied? Many of these pesticides for corn and soybean fields are not labeled for human consumption. So, and then the last thing to touch upon before we open it up for questions is how to prevent this. So, the Practical Farmers of Iowa brochure on pesticide drift addresses a lot of these things. My guess is Liz will post a link to that. The first thing is if you are a sensitive crop like fruits and vegetables or organic, make sure you're registered on the IDAL Sensitive Crops Registry. You can do that through their webpage, the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship. If you can, keep honeybees and register your honeybee hives on the bee registry, which is available on the same website. Honeybees are of particular concern right now because of this colony collapse disorder and or other things. And so the state is pretty responsive when it comes to honeybees being sprayed, probably more so than they are on sensitive crops. So if you can find somebody if you don't want to keep bees yourself, see if you can find somebody to keep bees for you, and make sure you're registered on the bee registry. Another good thing to do is to call or send letters to your neighbors informing them, that, hey, I'm here and I've got sensitive crops on my farm. You can send a certified letter if you're kind of worried about it, so you can look back and say, yes, I did notify you. Just be aware that sending a certified letter out of the blue might be looked at in a not so great light by some folks. So definitely try to keep it civil. You'll be happier in the long run. Ask your neighbors just point blank, do you use custom applicators? Do you spray yourself? Which if they do, usually they can be pretty responsive. And if they do not do all of their own spraying and they do hire like a co-op, just say, okay, I'm going to contact that co-op and let the co-op know that I'm there, so that the co-op is aware and realize that you need to probably talk to a manager and make sure that you're tell them that you're documenting that you've contacted him or her, and that they need to make sure that the people actually applying in the field respect that. Install no spray signs if you can, all around your farm, and plant buffer strips like I talked about earlier. So, and I think we've timed it about right. That's our website. Okay, and there's a question from Arlene. It says, I have a question. If you're drifted upon by a spray not labeled for food crops, does that mean the crop shouldn't be sold for human consumption? Even... Okay. My understanding of that, Arlene, is that it should not be sold for human consumption. I mean, it's not labeled for that. It's better just to destroy the crop. I know Rob and Tammy. They
really hammered that home in their Farminar.
Fox, yeah, they had to destroy a fairly large percentage of the crop that was drifted on at their farm. And so it is, and it's horrible because they were throwing away perfectly good-looking eggplant and peppers, but they just didn't think they could, in good conscience do that. So, I'd like to open it up for questions or discussion if we can. Or back to Liz if she has things to add.
Thanks, Andy. We'll give people a few moments here to start typing in questions. Sometimes it takes a couple minutes for things to sink in. Is there anything you would have done differently in retrospect the second time? Or do you feel you operated pretty smoothly? Andy, can you hear me? Seems like their microphone's not working. I'm going to expand on Arlene's question and Andy's answer a little bit. I was speaking to another farmer who was drifted on last summer, and the chemical that they were hit with, or that they suspected they were hit with at the time, didn't have any allowable limits listed, not even a no allowable limit listed for food crops. And so she had a difficult time figuring out what she could do with that produce, because there wasn't anything written about it, because it was like sort of a new branch of the chemical. And she ended up, I believe, not selling the crop and destroying it, and also plowing under some fields, so that, because they had a U-pick and didn't want people going in there and getting things. So definitely check with that, and you can call Iowa State Extension and ask them about labels and pesticides. And you can also call the pesticide company, and they should give you that information really quickly. All right. So Andy and Melissa just called our office, and they are having some trouble with their microphone, so they're going to be back on in a minute. Are there any other questions you want to type into the chat box in the meantime? And I can field any if you have them also. I can say a little more about Practical Farmers' work on pesticide drift. We have a few things on our website under the horticulture page. There's a summary of case files. All the case files from the Pesticide Bureau are public record, and we went and took notes on all the cases related to organics and fruits and vegetables, just to get an idea of what was going on. So you can read those case files, see what's going on in the state. Is the state of Iowa taking any steps to raise awareness about this problem? The state, I guess I wouldn't say that the state is taking many steps. There are a few bills moving that have been introduced to the Iowa House and Senate this year, and Iowa Farmers Union and Pesticide Action Network have been working on those. And Pesticide Action Network with Iowa Farmers Union is also working on doing some speaking events around the state related to this. The Pesticide Bureau also on their website put up a brochure of what to do if you're drifted on, and what the responsibility of the Pesticide Bureau is, which is a new thing for them with regard to pesticide drift. So that was a positive step forward in transparency of the process for dealing with this. But beyond that, I wouldn't say that they're taking steps to raise awareness. The Iowa Farmers Union also made a request to some administrative changes, and those were denied. And if you're interested in those, you could contact Iowa Farmers Union. And I believe they were also circulated on the PFI policy discussion list. Another thing we're doing at Practical Farmers is, if you have a story about pesticide drift that you would like to share, or you'd be willing to, talk with other farmers if they have questions, I would love to have you, on a list that, or have you help you write your story and publish it in your local paper or a more regional paper if you're comfortable doing that. We are working with our field crop farmers as well on some parts of this. This coming year, I have several farmers that are going to be taking samples of their own ditches after they spray to determine if they're doing as good of a job as they think they are. So I think that's a good step forward for working with our field crop farmers as well. While these questions are typing, I'll also say we've worked with Pesticide Action Network the past 2 years to do drift catchers in Iowa, and we are doing that, working with them again this year. And they already have their drift catcher farmers selected for the year. But if you're interested in coming to the training and learning about them, there will be information on our website, and that training is in Grinnell this year. And we'll feed you lunch. So I'll make sure that information is on our website. And the drift catcher is a citizen science tool. It takes a vacuum sip of the air when you turn it on for every half hour or so, and then they analyze those samples to see if there are pesticides in the ambient air. And they've been using those in California and Minnesota for several years, and this is the third year that they'll be using them in Iowa. So Rick's question about taking samples on your own. If you feel that you need to take samples right away before IDALs can get there, I would call one of the private chemical testing labs. We have a list of them on our website, on the horticulture page on our website. Call one of those labs, and they will give you very specific instructions on how to take those samples, how to label them and package them and send them to the lab to have a quality analysis done. So I know that some folks have used the South Dakota lab with great results, and I talked to a number of the labs on that list, and they seem like they'd be easy to work with. The samples are expensive. They can be, I think, $300 to $400 per sample, but in some cases it's definitely to your advantage to do that. It isn't too difficult to take samples. It's what it is just clipping foliage, or it can also be a swab of your T-shirt if you were sprayed yourself or something like that. But the specific protocols, you should call the lab. Great. Thanks, Melanie. Welcome back, Andy and Melissa.
Thanks. Any other questions that anybody has?
I guess I have a question for you guys. I mean, Melissa's really sharp with the accounting tools, and I'm curious how tough of a process was it for you to think through all the labor steps and account for that, and what can people do to best prepare for that type of situation?
Well, like most of the data came out of our QuickBooks, so we were able to export that and create that spreadsheet pretty easily. But again, that's just because we're kind of trained to keep those records. As far as the labor goes, this year, 2014, was our first year of having to segregate that crop. So we just kind of made notes along the way about everything that we had to do in addition that we wouldn't normally do. And that was kind of a pain. I mean, the crew thought it was a pain. We thought it was a pain. And then we realized we looked at this list of everything that we had to modify because of this drift incident. And that's how we kind of came up with that number, because it really does add up. I mean, just like the processing of asparagus, for example, it comes out of the field oftentimes muddy, for example, and it's in these totes. Well, those totes can't come into contact with anything else in the shed because they're contaminated. The knives have to get disinfected before they can go out and, harvest another crop that is organic. And so those are just a couple of examples of things that we had to really keep an eye on. And, it was, it was just kind of keeping notes on all of those different little steps that we had to do, and just kind of tallying it up and coming up with a really reasonable number. So it was kind of painful, but at least for the next 2 years we've got a pretty good roadmap, so it should be a little bit easier on our end. Does that help answer that question? You're on, honey.
Yeah, sorry, I was getting a spinning pinwheel on my computer screen there. Do you know if that farmer is planning to do seed corn ever again, or are they off that?
No, I'm not sure how much to go into this. The farmer really wasn't exposed to risk in this circumstance because he wasn't they're not. If you're doing seed corn, the seed company does almost everything other than prep the ground and plant, and that's basically all the farmer does. And so he wasn't liable at all. And I think he would be open to it, but he was very frustrated because he wants to be a good neighbor, and he doesn't like having to deal with this any more than anyone else might want to have to deal with it. So they're not going to do seed corn there this year. This year they would be scheduled to, but seed corn sales are down quite a bit as corn prices have slumped, and so a lot of the seed corn companies are not raising as much seed corn as they have in the past. So they're not doing it at least this year.
Mhm.
And we also think that the seed corn company is worried about potential drift, and so they have said that they're going to raise more corn further north of us where there are fewer people.
Interesting. So there's a question about drift occurrences yearly, and I actually do have that data in my email because I emailed the Pesticide Bureau and asked for it. So let's see. In 20 up till the first of the year this year, so January of 2015, there were 67 incidents reported during the 2014 season. Of those, 19 had alleged human exposure. 7 were commercial gardens, 5 were organic, and 2 were orchards. In 2013, there were 104 incidents reported. 2012, there were 88. 2011, there were 70. And those are actually those are just the incidents that relate to organics, humans, or food for human consumption, which is what I was asking them about. I didn't get the total numbers, I guess. But that might be what you're interested in. Oh, Melissa, I was cutting out. Can you hear me?
Now we can. Sorry.
That's right. Rick, did you hear my answer?
Is there anything else you want us to touch on, Liz? You're pretty steeped in this.
Great. And all the information of the Pesticide Bureau is public record. You do, if you want files pulled and copied, you have to pay for it. But if you just call and ask for a simple data request, they can usually get that to you within a week. Any more questions from folks? Guess you covered the topic pretty well, Andy. Andy and Melissa, I have a question. What would you like to see? How would you like farmers to respond moving forward on
Thanks.
this issue?
Does that mean we can conclude?
Oh, how would you like to see farmers sort of respond as a community on this issue? If you have any ideas on that.
Go ahead. That's a loaded question.
I think it goes beyond just farmers. I mean, this is kind of a personal topic. I think you have to even look at the people that are in town, and I think they're just as affected as we are as farmers. You try and take your child for a walk during the spring or the summer, and it almost feels like they can't walk on the grass. You're on the sidewalk and you've got all these no spray signs, don't walk on the grass for 24 to 48 hours. It's been chemically treated.
Not no spray.
Or they're not no spray, but you guys know what I'm talking about. They go up every spring and summer, because people don't like dandelions. And so I think it's more than just the farmers coming together. I think it's, people in general. And I would like to just raise awareness, by, I don't know, we try and post every year. We go onto our Facebook site and we give the number to idols, not only for our farmer friends, but also for the people who are living in town and have these, lawns that are continuously being sprayed. So that way, even if their neighbors are spraying, maybe they can get, if they see spray drift, that they can do something about it. And so that's one of the things that we do. And I think the Pesticide Action Network, I think that's a really, really good, first step. I think that they do really amazing work, and we're looking forward to having them coming to Grinnell. So I would definitely get, hooked up with them to see if you can become a drift catcher. And Andy, would you have anything else that you'd want to do?
When it comes to applications, I think especially for specialty crop growers, is to have some of those conversations with your conventional neighbors. Just like they're aware of what you're doing, and a lot of them do understand business, and so like if you've got a business plan and you're selling a product that's value added, a lot of them respect that kind of they really seem to respect that, and they usually, for the most part, most people will respond, and if you say, look, this really directly impacts me.
I'm always open to ideas from farmers on things that they would like PFI to do regarding pesticide drift work. We have been trying to get some letters to the editor written on the importance of small farms and of raising awareness for drift. So if you know someone who's a good candidate for writing one of those letters, either from a farmer perspective or perhaps a chef or restaurant in the organic, natural, local realm, or even if you have a concerned eater that has a good turn with words, I'd be interested in working with them on that. So I think when it happens to somebody, they want to talk about it, but for a number of reasons, right after it happens isn't a great time to do that. I think, I appreciate the members like you guys that have stayed engaged after incidents have occurred and that have been willing to speak with people that have had, drift occurrences since then.
Yeah, and I don't want to say that it's just specialty crop growers either. Like anecdotally, where I grew up in Northeast Iowa, I'm still in touch with a lot of farmers up in that area, and there are numerous examples where people have had non-GMO corn or soy get drifted on by Roundup and lost at least portions of their fields. And I've also heard anecdotally of farmers who more or less feel that they're forced to plant GM crops, even if they don't want to because they might be feeding livestock or something, but just because they know that they're going to be drifted upon when the co-op sprays or something like that. So I know of these instances occurring. It's not just specialty crop growers.
And I think one of the reasons that, we agreed to do this Farminar on drift and our situation was because we firmly believe, unfortunately, money does most of the talking in this world and helps push policy. We think that, by more people coming forward and monitoring spray drift and reporting it and pushing for settlements like we have, maybe that'll start to really impact like the insurance companies' pocketbooks. And maybe that's where the change unfortunately needs to start. I mean, you looked at the numbers from our asparagus spreadsheet, and we're not going to give an exact number, but we were provided with a pretty hefty sum for our drift incident. And I would like to think that, if there are several of those, maybe the insurance companies will start pushing, their applicators back a little bit, and maybe that will, they'll start to pay attention because then they'll be financially impacted for, being liable for drifting on farmers like ours. So.
And I started out the conversation by saying one of the dirty little secrets of conventional ag is the spray drift. If you were actually to comply with wind speed regulations on a lot of these products, you would need many more spray rigs than exist, and you would need many more drivers than are trained. And that would make it so that the entire model maybe wouldn't be so economically viable. And if you actually do push a little bit and say, look, you killed all the shrubs in my yard. Even if you don't have a farm, but you lose half the trees in your yard,
Mm-hmm.
You don't really have to put up with
Rick's
that.
question:
It really is
GMO
against
corn
the law.
pollen contaminating
So
my corn be considered
I'm not
drift?
trying to be a bad neighbor, but I don't want my neighbors applying chemicals on my ground any more than they want
That
me
is not a
applying
topic in which I
chemicals on their
have
ground.
much
So,
expertise.
no. No, if anything, the corn pollen won't be expressed in your corn plant if
Yeah.
you plant a non-GMO variety, because you'd actually have to have your corn pollinated and then save that seed. And
I
if you
agree
do
with
that,
that.
you're actually stealing intellectual property, and you'd be the one who's prosecuted. So the answer to that is no.
I feel pretty comfortable ending 9 minutes early. I don't see any more questions coming in, so
If there aren't any other
thank you,
questions,
Andy and
I don't
Melissa,
know if
for
there's anything
doing this
else you'd
Farminar.
like
It
me
will
to touch
be
upon, Liz, or-
archived with the others, and I think it'll get quite a few. Oh, we've got maybe another Rick question. But we'll have it archived, and I know